In 1864, deep in the American South, Colonel Augustus Fairfield did the unthinkable. He created an arrangement that allowed 7 of his enslaved men to have intimate relations with his own wife, Lady Margaret. What began as a desperate attempt to save his lineage ended up destroying one of the most powerful families in the region. You're watching Shadow Chronicles, where we unearth the most disturbing and never-before-told stories from America's darkest chapter. If this content impacts you, hit that like button to support our work. We spend countless hours in historical archives to bring you these narratives. Share this with anyone who needs to understand our true history. And before we go any further, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We want to know if our audience is spread across the country or around the world. And while you're at it, tell us what you would do if you discovered a family secret as disturbing as this one. Make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to dive deep into a story that will change how you see history forever. The year was 1864. America was in the midst of its bloodiest conflict, the Civil War, but on the plantations of the Deep South, the system of slavery still functioned with total brutality. The Fairfield estate, located 15 miles outside Charleston, was one of the most prosperous properties in the region. Its cotton fields stretched across the rolling hills, and its remaining assets were still sufficient to maintain the luxury of the manor house. Colonel Augustus Fairfield, at 52 years old, was respected throughout the county. A descendant of early settlers, he had built his fortune through 3 generations of agricultural exploitation. His property housed more than 200 enslaved people divided between work in the fields, in processing facilities, and in the manor house itself. Lady Margaret Fairfield, his wife of 15 years, was considered one of the most beautiful women in the region. At 35, she maintained the elegance and posture required of a lady of the Southern elite. Educated at a finishing school in Boston, she spoke French fluently and played piano with mastery. The marriage had been arranged in 1849, uniting 2 traditional families. For 15 years, they had tried to have children. Lady Margaret had become pregnant 4 times, but lost all the babies in the first months. The doctors of the era couldn't explain the successive losses, attributing them to the woman's delicate constitution. For Colonel Augustus, the absence of heirs represented more than a personal tragedy. It meant the end of a dynasty. Without children, his immense fortune would be disputed by distant relatives after his death. The social pressure was immense. In the patriarchal society of the 19th century, a man without descendants was considered incomplete. It was in December of 1863 that everything began to change. The colonel received a letter from his cousin in Louisiana, telling of unorthodox practices that had resulted in the birth of heirs on other plantations. What was written in that letter would plant the seed of the most controversial decision of his life. The letter arrived on a hot December morning, brought by a messenger who had ridden for 3 days from New Orleans. The colonel's cousin, Jonathan Fairfield, was known for his creative solutions to family problems. The correspondence brought a detailed account of how other families of the Louisiana elite had resolved questions of inheritance. "My dear cousin Augustus," the letter read, "I know of your difficulties in producing descendants. Allow me to share knowledge that may seem controversial, but which has proven effective in our region. Mr. Robert Beauregard, our neighbor, faced a similar situation. His wife, after years of fruitless attempts, managed to give him 3 robust sons through an unconventional method." The letter went on to describe how some families allowed specific enslaved men, chosen for their health and physical vigor, to maintain relations with the ladies, always under supervision and total control of the husbands. The children born of these unions were registered as legitimate, guaranteeing the continuity of the lineage. Colonel Augustus read and reread the correspondence for weeks. The idea disturbed him profoundly, but also awakened a desperate hope. His religious upbringing and the values of the era made the proposal almost unthinkable. However, the prospect of dying without heirs tormented him more than any moral consideration. During the month of January 1864, the colonel discreetly observed the enslaved men on his property. He began to notice details that had previously gone unperceived. Which were healthiest? Which demonstrated greater intelligence? Which had physical characteristics that could improve his descendants? Slavery had created a mentality where human beings were seen as property and instruments. For the colonel, The enslaved were not people with rights or feelings. They were tools that could be used to solve his succession problem. Lady Margaret noticed changes in her husband's behavior. He observed her with more intensity, asked strange questions about her menstrual cycle, and demonstrated renewed interest in matters related to procreation. When he finally decided to reveal the contents of the letter, he chose an evening in February after dinner. "Margaret," he said, "we need to talk about our situation. I have a proposal that can give us the children we so desire, but it requires your complete cooperation and discretion." Lady Margaret's initial reaction was one of shock and revulsion. The idea of maintaining intimate relations with enslaved men contradicted everything she had learned about morality and social position. She argued, cried, and begged her husband to reconsider. But the colonel had made his decision. He presented the proposal not as a request, but as a determination. In the patriarchal society of the era, women had little power of decision over their own lives. The husband's authority was absolute, especially in matters considered familial. February 1864 marked the beginning of the most bizarre process in the history of Fairfield Estate. Colonel Augustus established rigorous criteria for the selection of the enslaved men who would participate in his plan. It wouldn't be a random choice. Every detail was calculated to maximize the chances of success. The first criterion was physical health. The colonel sent for the family doctor, Dr. Henry Anderson, under the pretext of conducting routine examinations of the enslaved workers. The doctor, without knowing the true intentions, examined all the men between 20 and 35 years old, identifying the healthiest and most robust. The second criterion was intelligence. The colonel observed which enslaved men demonstrated greater capacity for reasoning, refined manual skills, or knowledge about agriculture. He believed these characteristics could be transmitted to future heirs. The third criterion, though never openly admitted, was physical appearance. The colonel wanted the children born of the arrangement to have characteristics that wouldn't immediately denounce their mixed origin. He looked for enslaved men with lighter skin and features that approximated European standards. After 2 weeks of observation, 7 enslaved men were selected. John Christopher, 28 years old, mixed race, worked as a foreman in the cotton fields. He was literate and demonstrated natural leadership among the other enslaved workers. Michael Santos, 25 years old, light mulatto, responsible for maintaining the cotton gin machinery. He had exceptional mechanical abilities for the era. Anthony Silva, 30 years old, worked caring for the estate's horses. He was known for his physical strength and knowledge of animal husbandry. Peter Gonzalez, 26 years old, mixed race, worked in the manor house as assistant to the butler. He could read and write, maintaining the property's records. Francis Asher, 24 years old, mulatto, responsible for cultivating the gardens that supplied the manor house. He had knowledge of medicinal plants. Joseph Morris, 29 years old, experienced worker, knew all aspects of the estate's operations. He was respected by the other enslaved people for his wisdom. Lewis Carter, 27 years old, mixed race, skilled carpenter, responsible for the construction and maintenance of the estate's structures. The selection wasn't immediately communicated to those chosen. The colonel first needed to establish the rules of the arrangement and prepare Lady Margaret for what was to come. During the month of March, he built a small house in the back of the property, far from curious eyes. The location would be used for the encounters, guaranteeing privacy and total control over the situation. Pause for a moment and reflect. We're talking about human beings being treated as reproductive instruments. The slave-holding mentality transformed people into objects, denying them any humanity or right of choice. If you're feeling disturbed by this story, leave your like. It's exactly this reflection that we need to make about our past. On March 15, 1864, Colonel Augustus summoned the 7 selected enslaved men to a meeting on the veranda of the manor house. It was a cold morning typical of the southern spring, with mist covering the hills around the estate. The men positioned themselves in a semicircle, standing, awaiting their master's words. "You have been chosen for a special task," the colonel began, walking slowly before the 7. "A task that can bring benefits to all of us, but which requires absolute discretion and obedience." The silence was total. The enslaved men kept their eyes lowered, typical posture when in the presence of the master. None of them imagined what was coming. "My wife and I have faced difficulties having children," the colonel continued. "You will help resolve this situation. Each of you will have the opportunity to contribute so that Lady Margaret becomes pregnant." The revelation caused visible shock in the men. John Christopher, the most experienced of the group, dared to discreetly raise his eyes, trying to comprehend if he had understood correctly. Michael Santos clenched his fists, controlling his surprise. The others remained motionless, processing the impossible information. The colonel proceeded to explain the rules of the arrangement. Each enslaved man would have a specific day of the week designated for encounters with Lady Margaret. The encounters would always occur in the house built especially for this purpose, always under his indirect supervision. Any attempt at contact outside the established schedule would be punished with death. The enslaved men who participated in the arrangement would receive benefits: better food, new clothes, exemption from heavier work, and the promise of eventual freedom. But it was also made clear that refusal was not an option. In the slave-holding logic, they were property and should obey without question. "If any of you manages to father a child with my wife," declared the colonel, "that man will receive his freedom and a sum of money sufficient to start a new life. The others will continue receiving the promised benefits." The promise of freedom was both a motivation and a form of control. The colonel knew he was creating competition among the enslaved men, decreasing the chances of rebellion or conspiracy. John Christopher was designated for Mondays, Michael for Tuesdays, Anthony for Wednesdays, Peter for Thursdays, Francis for Fridays, Joseph for Saturdays, and Louis for Sundays. The schedule would be followed rigorously during Lady Margaret's fertile period each month. Lady Margaret, who observed the scene from a manor house window, felt a mixture of humiliation and terror. She had spent weeks trying to convince her husband to abandon the idea, but her pleas were ignored. In the patriarchal society of the era, she had no choice but to submit to her husband's will. The family doctor was informed about the special treatment that Lady Margaret would receive to increase her chances of becoming pregnant. Dr. Henry Anderson, though surprised, didn't question the colonel's decisions. The medicine of the era frequently recommended unorthodox methods for fertility problems. The first week of the arrangement was scheduled to begin in April, coinciding with Lady Margaret's fertile period. The enslaved men were instructed on how to proceed, what clothes to wear, and how to behave during the encounters. Everything was planned to maintain the lady's apparent dignity, even in such a degrading situation. Monday, April 4th, 1864, dawned rainy. The drizzle typical of southern spring covered Fairfield Estate with a blanket of melancholy that seemed to reflect the tense environment dominating the property. Lady Margaret awoke knowing this would be the most difficult day of her life. John Christopher had received detailed instructions the evening before. He should bathe, wear clean clothes, and proceed to the back house at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The colonel would be nearby, not inside the room, but close enough to ensure everything proceeded according to plan. The small house had been furnished simply but adequately. A bed with clean sheets, a basin with water for hygiene, curtains that blocked the afternoon light. Everything designed to create an environment that was functional yet impersonal. If this first part has impacted you, imagine what's coming next. Hit that like button right now and make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because the next 3 parts of this story will reveal details that are even more disturbing. Comment below if you think stories like this should be taught in schools, because understanding our true history is the only way we can build a better future. Lady Margaret arrived at the small house accompanied by her personal maid, Martha, an elderly enslaved woman who had served the family for decades. Martha had been instructed to assist her mistress with preparations and then wait outside. The tension in the air was palpable. John Christopher arrived precisely at 3 o'clock. He walked slowly toward the house, each step feeling heavier than the last. Despite being an enslaved man accustomed to obeying orders without question, this situation transcended anything he had experienced before. The dehumanization of slavery had prepared him for physical labor, punishment, and humiliation, but not for this intimate violation disguised as opportunity. Lady Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. When John entered, she couldn't look at him. The silence between them was oppressive, filled with the weight of what they were being forced to do. "Ma'am," John finally spoke, his voice low and respectful. "I understand this situation is difficult for both of us. I want you to know that I take no pleasure in what we're being forced to do." The acknowledgement of their shared suffering created a brief moment of human connection in an utterly dehumanizing situation. Lady Margaret looked up for the first time, seeing not an enslaved man or an instrument, but a human being as trapped as she was. The encounters that followed over the weeks were marked by this same uncomfortable dynamic. Each of the 7 men approached the situation differently. Michael Santos tried to make conversation beforehand, perhaps seeking to normalize something inherently abnormal. Anthony Silva maintained complete silence, treating each encounter as a mechanical task to be completed. Peter Gonzalez, being more educated, attempted to show respect through formal language and careful behavior. Francis Asher brought medicinal herbs, suggesting they might help with conception. Joseph Morris prayed silently before each encounter, seeking divine forgiveness for what he was being compelled to do. Louis Carter, the youngest and most sensitive, often struggled to perform, overwhelmed by the psychological burden of the arrangement. Colonel Augustus maintained strict control over every aspect of the arrangement. He kept detailed records of each encounter, tracking Lady Margaret's menstrual cycle with scientific precision. He consulted medical books of the era, seeking any knowledge that might increase the chances of conception. His obsession with producing an heir had completely overtaken his rational thinking. The colonel's behavior toward the 7 enslaved men became increasingly erratic. Some days he treated them with unusual generosity, providing extra food and lighter work assignments. Other days, he would explode in rage over minor infractions, as if punishing them for his own moral compromise. The other enslaved people on the estate began to notice something strange was happening. The 7 men received special treatment, wore better clothes, and were often exempt from the hardest labor. Whispers and speculation spread through the quarters where the enslaved population lived. Some suspected the men had been chosen for a special project related to the war effort. Others noticed the pattern of the men's absences and began to piece together a more disturbing truth. The overseers, white men hired to supervise the enslaved workers, also noticed the unusual treatment of the 7 men. Questions were raised, but the colonel shut down inquiries with threats of dismissal. By June 1864, 2 months into the arrangement, Lady Margaret still hadn't conceived. The colonel's frustration grew daily. He increased the frequency of encounters, demanding that some of the men visit twice per week instead of once. The intensification of the schedule took a severe psychological toll on everyone involved. Lady Margaret developed insomnia and lost weight. She began drinking laudanum, a common opiate-based medicine of the era, to cope with the emotional trauma. Her personal maid, Martha, watched helplessly as her mistress deteriorated mentally and physically. The 7 enslaved men also showed signs of psychological damage. John Christopher, once a natural leader among the enslaved population, became withdrawn and isolated. Michael Santos developed a nervous twitch and started making mistakes in his mechanical work. Anthony Silva began drinking whatever alcohol he could obtain, trying to numb himself to the reality of his situation. The promise of freedom that had initially seemed like motivation now felt like a cruel taunt. Each man knew that only one could potentially earn freedom through fathering a child, creating an undercurrent of competition and resentment among them. In July 1864, something unexpected happened that would change the dynamic of the arrangement. Francis Asher, during one of his scheduled encounters, had an emotional breakdown. He confessed to Lady Margaret that he had a wife and children among the enslaved population, and that the guilt of what he was being forced to do was destroying him. Lady Margaret, moved by his confession, began to see the enslaved men not as instruments, but as human beings with families, feelings, and moral struggles of their own. This realization made the continuation of the arrangement even more unbearable for her. She began to plead with her husband to end the experiment, arguing that it was destroying everyone involved. Colonel Augustus refused to consider stopping. He had invested too much in the plan, both materially and psychologically. To stop now would be to admit failure and confront the moral enormity of what he had done. Instead, he intensified his efforts, consulting with doctors about additional methods to increase fertility. The doctor prescribed various tonics and treatments for Lady Margaret, some containing mercury and other substances now known to be harmful. The medical interventions, combined with the psychological trauma, further damaged her health. By August 1864, the situation on the estate had become visibly abnormal to outside observers. Visitors noticed Lady Margaret's deteriorated condition and the Colonel's erratic behavior. Social invitations declined as rumors began to circulate among the elite of Charleston society. The carefully maintained facade of respectability was beginning to crack. One evening in late August, Peter Gonzalez requested a private conversation with the Colonel. He suggested that perhaps God was preventing conception because the arrangement itself was sinful. He proposed that the Colonel and Lady Margaret seek divine guidance and consider adoption or accepting their childless state. The Colonel's response was explosive. He had Peter severely whipped for insubordinance. Despite Peter being one of his selected men, the punishment sent a clear message to the others. Questioning the arrangement was forbidden. The whipping of Peter Gonzalez marked a turning point. The other enslaved men realized that the promises of better treatment were conditional and could be revoked instantly. The thin veneer of this being a mutually beneficial arrangement was stripped away, revealing it for what it truly was: forced reproductive exploitation. In September 1864, after 5 months of the arrangement, Lady Margaret finally conceived. The news brought both relief and anxiety to everyone involved. The Colonel was elated, seeing the pregnancy as validation of his plan. Lady Margaret felt a complex mixture of joy at potentially having a child and horror at not knowing which of the 7 men had fathered it. The 7 enslaved men each privately wondered if the child was his and what that might mean for his future. The Colonel announced that the encounters would continue until the pregnancy was confirmed stable, just to ensure conception had truly occurred. This decision revealed that his primary concern was producing an heir, not the welfare of his wife or the enslaved men. It also suggested he was concerned about the paternity being uncertain and wanted to maintain plausible deniability. By October 1864, the pregnancy was confirmed stable, and the scheduled encounters were officially suspended. The 7 enslaved men were returned to their regular duties, though they continued to receive better treatment than the other enslaved workers. The Colonel's behavior became increasingly paranoid. He began to worry about what would happen when the child was born. What if the baby had features that made its mixed ancestry obvious? What if the enslaved men talked? What if Lady Margaret confessed to someone? To address these concerns, he began planning how to maintain control over the situation after the birth. He considered selling some of the 7 men to distant plantations, eliminating potential witnesses. He contemplated moving the family to a different region, where no one knew their history. Lady Margaret's pregnancy progressed through the fall and winter of 1864. As her body changed, so did her mental state. She began to bond with the child growing inside her, regardless of its paternity. The maternal instinct began to overshadow the traumatic circumstances of conception. However, she also lived in constant fear of what would happen when the child was born. Would it be obvious that the Colonel wasn't the father? How would they explain it to society? What kind of life would the child have, born of such a disturbing arrangement? The 7 enslaved men continued their work, but they were forever changed by the experience. They had been forced into a situation that violated not only their bodies, but their fundamental human dignity. Some of them began to plan escape, seeing it as the only way to achieve true freedom. Others resigned themselves to waiting for the promised freedom if one of them was identified as the father. John Christopher, who had maintained the most composure throughout the arrangement, began to secretly teach other enslaved workers to read and write. He saw education as a form of resistance and preparation for eventual freedom. His activities were dangerous, as teaching enslaved people to read was illegal in most southern states. By December 1864, Lady Margaret was 6 months pregnant. The elite of Charleston had been informed of the pregnancy through carefully crafted announcements. The Colonel portrayed it as a miracle after years of trying, a blessing from God. Social visits resumed, with ladies of society coming to congratulate Lady Margaret and offer advice about childbirth and motherhood. But those who looked closely could see the strain in her eyes and the forced nature of her smiles. The winter of 1864-1865 was particularly cold. The Civil War was entering its final phase, with Union forces making significant advances into Confederate territory. The future of slavery itself was uncertain, adding another layer of anxiety to an already tense situation. Colonel Augustus began to drink heavily, a habit that would intensify over the coming months. His internal conflict between satisfaction at having secured an heir and guilt over the means used to achieve it manifested in erratic mood swings and increasingly poor decision-making. In January 1865, as Lady Margaret entered her 7th month of pregnancy, an incident occurred that nearly exposed the arrangement. Lewis Carter, overwhelmed by guilt and psychological torment, attempted to run away. He was caught by patrollers before he could get far from the estate. The standard punishment for attempted escape was severe whipping or worse. But the colonel faced a dilemma. If Louis was the father of Lady Margaret's child, harming him could be seen as jeopardizing the bloodline the colonel so desperately wanted to establish. Instead, Louis was placed in solitary confinement in a small building on the estate, isolated from all other workers. The other 6 men understood the message. They were valuable only as potential fathers, and that value could disappear at any moment. February 1865 brought increasing tension to the estate. Union forces were approaching the region, and rumors spread that enslaved people would soon be freed. The colonel became obsessed with securing his legacy before the old order collapsed entirely. He pressured Lady Margaret to write a will declaring that any children born to her were legitimate heirs to the Fairfield fortune, regardless of circumstances. She reluctantly complied, understanding that her child's future depended on legal protection. As March approached, Lady Margaret prepared for childbirth with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The midwife was prepared, the nursery was ready, and prayers were offered for a safe delivery. But everyone involved knew that the moment of birth would be the moment of truth. Would the child's appearance betray the secret of its conception? The answer to that question would determine the fate of everyone involved in the arrangement. If you're still with us after this second part, you understand just how deep this darkness goes. This isn't just history, it's a window into the systematic dehumanization that slavery created. Smash that like button, share this with someone who needs to understand our true past, and drop a comment about what you're thinking right now. The next part reveals what happened when the child was born, and trust me, you're not ready for what's coming. Make sure you're subscribed because part 3 is going to change everything you thought you knew about this story. March 1865 arrived with unseasonable warmth across the South. The war was reaching its inevitable conclusion, with Confederate forces collapsing on multiple fronts. But inside Fairfield Estate, all attention focused on the impending birth that would determine the fate of everyone connected to the colonel's arrangement. Lady Margaret went into labor on the evening of March 23rd. The midwife, Mrs. Elizabeth Crawford, had been summoned from Charleston specifically for this delivery. She was a respected practitioner who had delivered hundreds of babies for the region's elite families. What she didn't know was that this birth carried implications far beyond the usual concerns of maternal and infant health. The labor was long and difficult. Lady Margaret's weakened physical state, damaged by months of laudanum use and psychological trauma, made the delivery complicated. She labored through the night and into the next day, her screams echoing through the manor house. Colonel Augustus paced outside the room, drinking whiskey and chain-smoking cigars. His anxiety had nothing to do with concern for his wife's welfare and everything to do with what the baby would look like. The 7 enslaved men, though assigned to their regular duties, were acutely aware that this day would change their lives forever. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon on March 24th, the baby was born. A girl. She emerged into the world with a lusty cry that could be heard throughout the house. Mrs. Crawford cleaned the infant and wrapped her in soft blankets before presenting her to the exhausted mother. Lady Margaret, despite her physical and emotional exhaustion, felt a surge of maternal love when she held her daughter for the first time. The baby girl had light skin, lighter than any of the 7 potential fathers, but darker than would be expected from 2 parents of pure European descent. Her hair was black and showed a slight curl. Her features were delicate and beautiful, but anyone with experience could identify mixed ancestry. Colonel Augustus entered the room and approached the bed. He looked at the baby with an expression that combined satisfaction, anxiety, and something darker that might have been disgust. "She's perfect," Lady Margaret said defensively, clutching her daughter closer. "She's light enough," the colonel replied coldly. his comment revealing that his primary concern was whether the child could pass for white in society. The midwife, Mrs. Crawford, noticed the unusual exchange but said nothing. Years of serving elite families had taught her that discretion was essential to maintaining her position. The baby was named Margaret Caroline Fairfield, after her mother and the Colonel's grandmother. The birth announcement sent to Charleston society declared the arrival of a healthy daughter to Colonel and Lady Margaret Fairfield, with no mention of any unusual circumstances. For the first few weeks, visitors came to see the new baby and congratulate the parents. Most commented on how beautiful little Margaret Caroline was, though some made observations about her darker complexion and hair texture. The Colonel explained these features as throwbacks to distant Mediterranean ancestors, a common excuse used in the era to explain away visible evidence of mixed ancestry. The question now facing Colonel Augustus was what to do with the 7 enslaved men. He had promised freedom to whomever fathered a child, but he had no way of knowing with certainty which man was the father. Moreover, as the war ended and slavery collapsed throughout the South, the value of that promised freedom was diminishing. In April 1865, news reached the estate that General Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. The Civil War was effectively over, and with it the legal institution of slavery. The 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, would be ratified by the end of the year. The entire social and economic system that the Colonel's arrangement had been built upon was collapsing. Colonel Augustus made a decision that revealed his true character. He would not honor his promise of freedom and payment to any of the 7 men. Instead, he would eliminate all evidence of the arrangement. His plan was brutal in its simplicity. In May 1865, as chaos and confusion reigned across the defeated South, the Colonel began systematically separating the 7 men from the estate. John Christopher was sold to a trader heading west, despite the collapsing slave market. The sale was illegal under the circumstances, but still possible in the chaotic transition period. Michael Santos was accused of theft and turned over to local authorities, disappearing into the brutal prison system of the post-war South. Anthony Silva was sent to work on a distant property the Colonel owned in the backcountry, effectively exiling him from any contact with the main estate or society. Peter Gonzalez, who had previously been whipped for questioning the arrangement, was sold to a lumber camp where working conditions were so harsh that survival rates were low. Francis Asher, who had brought medicinal herbs and shown compassion to Lady Margaret, was accused of poisoning livestock and was brutally beaten before being driven from the property. Joseph Morris, the oldest and wisest of the 7, saw what was happening and made a desperate escape attempt. He successfully fled north, disappearing into the confusion of the immediate post-war period. His fate remains unknown. Lewis Carter, who had previously attempted escape and been confined, was released from confinement only to be immediately accused of assault against an overseer. He was handed over to night riders, vigilante groups of former Confederates who terrorized newly freed black people. Lewis was never seen again. Within 2 months, all 7 men had been removed from the estate through violence, deception, or forced displacement. Not one received the promised freedom or payment. The Colonel's word, given so solemnly at the start of the arrangement, proved worthless. Lady Margaret watched this systematic elimination of the witnesses with growing horror. She understood that her husband was covering his tracks, erasing all evidence of what had been done. She also realized that if the 7 men could be disposed of so easily, her own position was precarious. She began to fear for her safety and that of her daughter. The relationship between Colonel Augustus and Lady Margaret, already damaged beyond repair by the arrangement, deteriorated completely. They barely spoke except when necessary for household management. The Colonel spent increasing amounts of time away from the manor house, drinking in Charleston or visiting other properties. Baby Margaret Caroline thrived physically, despite the toxic environment of her home. She was a healthy, happy infant who brought joy to her mother, even as everything else crumbled. Lady Margaret devoted herself completely to her daughter, finding in motherhood a purpose that sustained her through the psychological trauma. But as the baby grew, her mixed ancestry became more apparent. By 6 months old, her hair texture made it clear she had African ancestry. Her skin, while light, had undertones that distinguished her from children of purely European descent. Visitors began to make less diplomatic comments, and invitations to social events decreased. In the fall of 1865, Another development complicated the situation further. Lady Margaret discovered she was pregnant again. The timing made it impossible for the pregnancy to have resulted from the Colonel's involvement, as they had not been intimate since before the first pregnancy. The only explanation was that she had conceived during the final encounters with one of the 7 enslaved men before the birth of Margaret Caroline. This second pregnancy destroyed what remained of the family's reputation. When Lady Margaret's condition became visible, society's response was swift and brutal. Invitations ceased entirely. Former friends crossed the street to avoid greeting her. The family was completely ostracized from Charleston society. Colonel Augustus's response to the news of the second pregnancy revealed the depth of his moral bankruptcy. He raged at Lady Margaret, blaming her for the situation he himself had created. He demanded she terminate the pregnancy, something that was both dangerous and considered murder in that era. Lady Margaret refused. Despite the traumatic circumstances, she had bonded with her first child and felt protective of the second. She had also reached a breaking point where the Colonel's threats no longer controlled her. In November 1865, Lady Margaret gave birth to a son. She named him James Augustus, partly as a bitter irony directed at her husband. The baby boy's appearance made his mixed ancestry even more obvious than his sister's. His skin was noticeably darker, his hair tightly curled, and his facial features clearly showed African heritage. The birth of James Augustus marked the final collapse of any pretense. There was no way to explain away his appearance with stories of Mediterranean ancestors. The truth was obvious to anyone who saw him. Colonel Augustus refused to acknowledge the boy as his son and forbade Lady Margaret from claiming the child was legitimate. The Colonel's business affairs, already suffering from the economic devastation of the war and the end of slavery, entered terminal decline. Creditors began foreclosing on properties. The cotton crop failed due to lack of labor. The financial empire built over 3 generations collapsed in less than a year. In December 1865, a traveling minister arrived at Fairfield Estate. Reverend Thomas Mitchell had heard rumors about the unusual situation and felt called to investigate. Unlike Father Anthony, who had been easily intimidated, Reverend Mitchell was a crusader against the moral corruption he saw in the post-war South. He met with Lady Margaret and gained her trust. Over several conversations, she confessed the full story of the arrangement, the 7 enslaved men, and the circumstances of her children's births. The confession was cathartic for Lady Margaret, but would prove to have devastating consequences. Reverend Mitchell, believing he was doing God's work, began preaching about the sins of the Fairfield family in churches throughout the region. He didn't use names initially, but his descriptions were specific enough that everyone knew whom he meant. The story spread rapidly through gossip networks. Within weeks, the full details of Colonel Augustus's arrangement were common knowledge throughout the county. Former friends and associates of the Colonel publicly denounced him. Business partners severed connections. What remained of the family's social standing evaporated completely. In January 1866, local authorities launched an official investigation. While slavery had ended, there were still laws against adultery, fornication, and moral corruption. The investigation focused on whether charges could be brought against either the Colonel or Lady Margaret. The legal proceedings were chaotic and confused, reflecting the disorder of the immediate post-war period when old laws were being challenged and new ones had not yet been established. Testimony was gathered from the few remaining enslaved people who had witnessed parts of the arrangement. The investigation revealed additional disturbing details that had not been previously known. It came to light that the Colonel had kept detailed written records of the entire arrangement, including dates of encounters and observations about each of the 7 men's performance. These records, discovered during a search of his study, provided undeniable evidence of what had occurred. The documents revealed a level of calculated planning that made the arrangement even more disturbing than the rumors had suggested. The Colonel had treated the entire process as a breeding experiment, with notes about which combinations might produce the most desirable offspring. Public outrage intensified when the records became known. Even in a society that had recently accepted slavery, there was something uniquely disturbing about the Colonel's clinical approach to using enslaved men as breeding stock with his own wife. In February 1866, facing mounting pressure and social ostracism, the Colonel made an unexpected decision. He drafted a document acknowledging Margaret Caroline and James Augustus as his legal heirs, entitled to inherit the Fairfield estate. The document made no mention of their true paternity, but legally established them as legitimate children. The motivation for this decision was complex. Partly, the colonel wanted to ensure that the property stayed within the family name, rather than being claimed by distant relatives. Partly, he may have felt some responsibility for children he had caused to be brought into the world, even if not biologically his own. But the gesture came too late to repair the damage. The estate was drowning in debt. Creditors were circling. The property would soon be seized and sold at auction. The inheritance the colonel tried to secure for the children would amount to almost nothing. In March 1866, exactly 1 year after Margaret Caroline's birth, the situation reached its crisis point. The remaining enslaved people who had been freed but stayed on the estate as paid workers began to quit, finding the environment too toxic. The household staff diminished until only Martha, Lady Margaret's faithful maid, remained. The isolation was complete. The Fairfield family had been powerful, wealthy, and respected. Now they were pariahs, avoided by everyone, living in a decaying mansion with no resources and no future. The psychological toll on everyone involved was severe. Colonel Augustus's drinking intensified to the point of constant intoxication. Lady Margaret withdrew into herself, caring for her 2 children but barely interacting with anyone else. The children, innocent victims of circumstances they could never understand, were growing up in an environment of shame and isolation. One morning in late March, Martha discovered that several items of value had disappeared from the manor house. The colonel had apparently sold family heirlooms to pay for alcohol and basic necessities. The decline was not just social and financial, but complete moral collapse. By April 1866, it became clear that something would have to change. The family could not continue living in this suspended state of disgrace and poverty. The question was, what form that change would take, and who would suffer most when it came. If you've made it this far, you understand that this story is about more than just one family's downfall. It's about the systemic dehumanization that slavery created and how it destroyed everyone it touched, enslavers and enslaved alike. Hit that like button to support historical truth-telling. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand the real legacy of slavery, and comment your thoughts about how trauma like this echoes through generations. The final part is coming, and it reveals the ultimate fate of everyone involved in this tragedy. You need to subscribe right now because you won't want to miss the conclusion of this devastating true story. The spring of 1866 brought no renewal or hope to Fairfield Estate, only the continuation of decay and the approach of an inevitable reckoning. The property that had once stood as a symbol of prosperity and power now reflected the moral bankruptcy of the family that owned it. Fences fell into disrepair, fields grew wild with weeds, and the manor house itself began to show signs of neglect. Colonel Augustus spent most of his days in a drunken stupor, occasionally rousing himself to rage about the injustice of his situation. In his twisted perception, he was the victim, betrayed by a society that couldn't understand the desperate measures he had taken to preserve his legacy. The concept that he had committed profound moral wrongs against his wife and 7 human beings never seemed to penetrate his consciousness. Lady Margaret existed in a state of emotional numbness, broken only by moments of tenderness with her children. Margaret Caroline, now just over a year old, was walking and beginning to talk. Little James, at 5 months, was a happy baby who smiled easily despite the oppressive atmosphere of the household. The children represented both Lady Margaret's greatest joy and her deepest source of pain, constant reminders of the trauma she had endured. Martha, the elderly maid who had remained faithful throughout everything, became increasingly concerned about the family's welfare. She took it upon herself to ensure the children were properly fed and cared for, even as resources dwindled. In May 1866, the legal situation reached a critical point. The county court ruled on the creditors' claims against the Fairfield estate. The judgment was devastating. The entire property, including the manor house, land, and all remaining possessions, would be sold at public auction to satisfy debts. The family would be given 30 days to vacate the premises. Colonel Augustus received the news while intoxicated and responded with a violent outburst. He smashed furniture, threw objects, and screamed accusations at everyone around him. His rage was the impotent fury of a man who had lost everything through his own actions, but couldn't accept responsibility. Lady Margaret, by contrast, received the news with something approaching relief. The estate had become a prison, and eviction meant escape. She began quietly making plans for what would come next. She had a sister in Virginia who might take them in, at least temporarily. The challenge was getting there with 2 small children and no resources. The month of June 1866 passed in a strange limbo. The family remained in the manor house, but it no longer felt like their home. Prospective buyers came to inspect the property, walking through rooms that still contained the family's possessions. The humiliation was profound, but Lady Margaret endured it with the stoic dignity she had learned to maintain through years of suffering. During this period, something unexpected happened. One of the 7 enslaved men who had been part of the arrangement reappeared. Joseph Morris, who had successfully escaped the previous year, returned to the area. He had made his way north to Pennsylvania, found work, and begun building a new life. But he had come back with a specific purpose. Joseph sought out Lady Margaret privately, managing to meet with her without the Colonel's knowledge. The conversation between them was emotional and complex. Joseph wanted to know if either of the children was his. He explained that despite the horrific circumstances of their conception, he felt a responsibility toward any child he might have fathered. Lady Margaret was moved by his compassion and honesty. She allowed him to see both children. Joseph looked at Margaret, Caroline, and James with careful attention, but of course there was no way to know with certainty if either child was his. The physical characteristics could have come from any of the 7 men. "I've thought about this situation every day since I left," Joseph told her. "What was done to us was evil. What was done to you was evil. These children are innocent, and they deserve better than the legacy they've been given." He offered Lady Margaret money he had saved, a small amount, but significant given his circumstances. He also gave her the address where he could be reached in Pennsylvania, should she ever need assistance. The meeting with Joseph gave Lady Margaret something she desperately needed: confirmation that at least one of the 7 men had survived and was building a life in freedom. It also planted a seed of possibility. Perhaps she could make it north with her children, away from the South and its suffocating social judgment. In late June, 3 days before the family had to vacate the estate, Colonel Augustus disappeared. He left the manor house in the early morning without telling anyone where he was going. Hours passed, then a full day, then 2 days. Lady Margaret assumed he had gone to Charleston to drink and would eventually return. On the 3rd day, a rider brought terrible news. The colonel's body had been found in a ravine 15 miles from the estate. The official determination was that he had been riding while intoxicated, fallen from his horse, and broken his neck in the fall. It was ruled an accidental death. However, rumors immediately began circulating that he had taken his own life, deliberately riding to a location where he knew the terrain was dangerous, and allowing the fall to happen. Some locals even whispered that he had been murdered by associates of the 7 enslaved men, seeking revenge for what had been done. The truth died with the colonel, but the ambiguous circumstances of his death added one final scandal to the family's disgrace. The funeral was a grim affair. Few people attended, and those who did come were motivated by curiosity rather than respect. The minister delivering the service struggled to find anything positive to say about a man whose actions had shocked the community. Colonel Augustus Fairfield was buried in the family plot on the estate, the last family event that would occur on the property. With the colonel's death, Lady Margaret became solely responsible for her children and their future. The small inheritance she might have received from her husband's estate was completely consumed by debts. She was left with nothing but a few personal possessions and 2 small children of obviously mixed race. The auction of Fairfield Estate took place on July 4, 1866, a date that carried bitter irony. The property that had been built on enslaved labor was being sold on Independence Day, just months after slavery's abolition. The auction attracted a mix of opportunistic buyers and curious onlookers. The property sold for a fraction of its pre-war value to a northern investor who planned to divide it into smaller parcels. Everything inside the manor house was also auctioned, from furniture to dishes to personal items. Lady Margaret was allowed to keep only what she could carry, plus a small trunk of belongings. On July 6th, Lady Margaret left Fairfield Estate for the last time. She carried James in her arms while Martha held Margaret Caroline's hand. They had a single trunk containing clothes and a few precious items, including a locket that had belonged to Lady Margaret's mother. They walked down the long drive away from the manor house, not looking back. Their destination was the train station in Charleston, where Lady Margaret hoped to purchase tickets north with the money Joseph had given her, plus a small amount she had managed to save from selling some jewelry. The journey north was difficult and humiliating. Lady Margaret, traveling with two visibly mixed-race children, faced constant judgment and discrimination. Hotels refused them rooms. Restaurants would not serve them. They slept in train stations and ate whatever cheap food they could find. Martha, despite her age and the difficulty of the journey, remained a steady source of support and practical assistance. After nearly 2 weeks of travel, they reached Richmond, Virginia, where Lady Margaret's sister Catherine lived with her husband. Lady Margaret had written ahead explaining the situation and requesting help, but had received no response. When they arrived at Catherine's home, a modest but respectable house in a middle-class neighborhood, the reunion was tense. Catherine was shocked by her sister's appearance and appalled by the circumstances. Her husband, Richard, was even less welcoming. "You cannot stay here," Richard declared flatly. "We have our own reputation to consider. Your presence would destroy our standing in this community." Catherine was torn between loyalty to her sister and loyalty to her husband. In the end, familial bonds proved weaker than social pressure. She gave Lady Margaret a small amount of money and the address of a boarding house that might accept them, then sent them away. The rejection by her own family was perhaps the most painful blow Lady Margaret had experienced in a journey filled with pain. She had endured the forced arrangement with 7 men, the birth of children under horrific circumstances, public shame, and the loss of everything material. But being turned away by her sister cut deeper than any previous suffering. The boarding house Catherine had recommended was in a poor section of the city, but the landlady, Mrs. Morrison, was a widow who asked few questions and accepted Lady Margaret's money. The rooms were small and shabby, but they provided shelter. This boarding house would be home for the next several months. Lady Margaret found work as a seamstress, using skills she had learned in her privileged youth, but now applying them for survival rather than leisure. The work was tedious and poorly paid, but it was honest employment. Martha helped care for the children while Lady Margaret worked. The fall and winter of 1866 were periods of grinding poverty and hardship. They had enough to eat, barely, and a roof over their heads, but nothing more. Margaret Caroline, now approaching 2 years old, was beginning to understand that their life was different from other families. James, at 10 months, was oblivious to their circumstances, a happy baby who brought joy to his mother and Martha. In December 1866, Lady Margaret made a decision that would change their lives. She wrote to Joseph Morris in Pennsylvania, explaining their situation and asking if his offer of assistance was still valid. She didn't expect a response, but 3 weeks later, a letter arrived. Joseph wrote that he had married and was working as a carpenter in Philadelphia. He and his wife had a small house with an extra room. If Lady Margaret was willing to come to Philadelphia, they could stay with him until they got established. The offer was extraordinary in its generosity, especially given the circumstances. Joseph was offering shelter to the wife of the man who had exploited him and to children who might be his biological offspring. Lady Margaret accepted immediately. In January 1867, she, Martha, and the 2 children made the final leg of their journey north to Philadelphia. The city was crowded, industrial, and nothing like the genteel South they had known, but it also offered something precious: anonymity. In Philadelphia's diverse population, a woman with mixed-race children attracted less attention than in Virginia or South Carolina. Joseph and his wife Sarah welcomed them warmly. Sarah was a former enslaved woman who had escaped years before the war and built a life in the North. She understood trauma and survival in ways few people could. Over the following months, Lady Margaret slowly began to heal psychologically. The distance from the South and its associations helped. The kindness of Joseph and Sarah demonstrated that human decency could exist even after profound violations. Most importantly, she began to envision a future for her children that wasn't defined entirely by shame and suffering. Martha, now quite elderly, found peace in the Philadelphia household. She had devoted her entire life to serving the Fairfield family and in their exile and poverty, her service had become genuine care rather than forced labor. She died peacefully in her sleep in April 1867, having seen Lady Margaret and the children settled in relative safety. Margaret, Caroline, and James grew up in Philadelphia in the late 1860s and 1870s. They knew they were different, that their family history was complicated and painful, but they were loved and cared for. Lady Margaret never told them the full details of their conception, sparing them knowledge that would only cause pain. Joseph maintained his role as a protective figure in their lives, though he never claimed paternity or tried to replace the father figure the children lacked. Whether either child was biologically his remained unknown. As the children grew older, their mixed heritage in Philadelphia was less of an obstacle than it would have been in the South. They attended school, made friends, and began to build identities not entirely defined by their traumatic origins. Margaret Caroline, bright and determined, eventually became a teacher. James, mechanically inclined like several of the 7 potential fathers, became a skilled tradesman. Lady Margaret lived until 1889, dying at age 59. In her final years, she found a measure of peace, though the trauma of what she had endured never fully left her. She had survived slavery's last gasps and the moral bankruptcy it created, protecting her children and giving them opportunities she never had. Of the other 6 enslaved men who had been part of the Colonel's arrangement, only fragments of information survived. John Christopher reportedly died in a logging accident in Texas in 1868. Michael Santos was rumored to have made it to California, but no confirmed records exist. Anthony Silva's fate remains unknown. Peter Gonzalez died in the lumber camp where he had been sent, according to a notation in county records. Francis Asher may have returned to the Carolinas in the 1870s, but this cannot be verified. Lewis Carter, who had been handed over to night riders, was never found, living or dead. The Fairfield estate changed hands several times and was eventually subdivided into small farms. The manor house fell into disrepair and was torn down in 1885. Nothing remains today to mark the location where such profound suffering occurred. The story of Colonel Augustus Fairfield's arrangement faded from public memory within a generation. It was too disturbing, too shameful, and too complicated to fit into the narratives either the South or the North wanted to tell about slavery and its aftermath. But in the descendants of Margaret, Caroline, and James, and in the descendants of the 7 enslaved men whose names we know, the legacy of this history continues. Trauma echoes through generations, shaping families in ways both visible and invisible. The destruction caused by slavery didn't end with abolition. It rippled forward through time, affecting children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. This story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our history. Slavery didn't just involve field labor and physical punishment. It involved the complete dehumanization of people, reducing them to instruments to be used for any purpose their enslavers desired. It destroyed families, violated bodies, and created trauma that persisted long after legal freedom was achieved. The Colonel's arrangement was an extreme example, but it reflected the fundamental logic of slavery, that some human beings could be treated as property, their bodies and lives controlled completely by others. Lady Margaret's experience illustrates the precarious position of women in the 19th century, even privileged white women. She had no legal power to refuse her husband's demands, no resources to escape, and no social support system to protect her. Her suffering, while different from that of the enslaved men, was real and profound. The 7 enslaved men whose names we know, John Christopher, Michael Santos, Anthony Silva, Peter Gonzalez, Francis Asher, Joseph Morris, and Lewis Carter, deserve to be remembered not as instruments in a disturbing arrangement, but as human beings who endured unimaginable violations while maintaining their humanity. Joseph's kindness to Lady Margaret and her children, despite everything he had suffered, represents the resilience of the human spirit even in the face of systematic dehumanization. The children, Margaret, Caroline, and James, were innocent victims of circumstances they never chose and couldn't control. Their lives demonstrate both the long shadow cast by slavery's trauma and the possibility of transcending that trauma through love, support, and opportunity. This history matters today because the legacy of slavery continues to shape American society. The dehumanization, the trauma, the the destruction of families, the denial of dignity and autonomy. All of these created patterns that persisted long after slavery's legal abolition. Understanding these stories, as difficult as they are to hear, is essential to understanding the present. We must confront this history honestly, without sanitizing or minimizing it. The comfortable narratives that paint slavery as simply an unfortunate labor system miss the profound human devastation it caused. Stories like the Fairfield Arrangement reveal slavery's true nature, a system that corrupted everyone it touched, enslavers and enslaved alike, and created trauma that echoed through generations. If you've watched this entire series, you've engaged with one of the most difficult historical narratives we've ever presented. That engagement matters. Hit that like button to support historical truth-telling that doesn't shy away from difficult topics. Share this series with educators, students, and anyone who needs to understand the full reality of slavery's legacy. Comment below about what aspects of this story affected you most, and how you think we should approach teaching this history to future generations. Subscribe to Shadow Chronicles because we're committed to bringing you historical narratives that mainstream sources won't touch. These stories need to be told, remembered, and learned from. The only way we can build a better future is by honestly confronting the full truth of our past, no matter how disturbing that truth might be. Thank you for watching, for engaging, and for caring about historical truth. This is Shadow Chronicles, where we never forget that history's shadows still shape our present. Remember these names: John Christopher, Michael Santos, Anthony Silva, Peter Gonzalez, Francis Asher, Joseph Morris, and Lewis Carter. Remember Lady Margaret. Remember Margaret Caroline and James. Their stories are part of our collective history, and that history deserves to be known, understood, and never forgotten.